Welcome back to panel 4, which is Explorers, Exploration, and Collecting. This panel will be chaired by Adrianna Link, who is the curator for the history of science here at the American Philosophical Society. She received her PhD from the Department of History of Science and Technology at the Johns Hopkins University in 2016, where she specialized in the history of 20th century American anthropology. Her work has been published in the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences and The Atlantic, as well as in the edited volume on global transformation in the life sciences from 1945 to 1980, which came out in 2018. She is currently preparing a book manuscript on the history of urgent anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution, and up until 20 seconds ago, I didn't actually have her bio because I forgot to pick it up from one of our organizers. So then I was going to make up my own additions to what Adrianna does, because I know her and I can do that. In her spare time, Adrianna likes to hang glide over national parks. When she's not doing that, she's trying very hard to crossbreed tomatoes and guacamole so that you could have a plant that prepares you absolutely for avocado-based guacamole with only one ingredient. And for those of you who don't believe tomatoes belong in guacamole, I'm so sorry to tell you that you're wrong. Finally, she is working extremely hard to perfect chia pets as a sustainable means of infusing chia seeds in all of our diets. They're extremely important and an excellent source of protein. Without further ado, panel 4.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for that introduction. I never knew that I had a secret career as a hang glider, but maybe now's the time. Why not? It's my great pleasure to chair this panel on explorers, exploration, and collecting. And as has now been custom for this event, I will go through all of the bios for our presenters in the order that they will share their papers today. So first up, we'll hear from Cameron Strang, who's Associate Professor at the University of Nevada at Reno, who is an early Americanist who focuses on the history of science. What a combination here today, as well as borderlands, Native America, and the Atlantic world. His first book, Frontiers of Science, Imperialism and Natural Knowledge in the Gulf South Borderlands, 1500 to 1850, won the Summerlee Book Prize and the Michael V.R. Thomason Book Award and was published in 2018. He's received support for his research from numerous institutions, including the Smithsonian, Library of Congress, and the National Science Foundation and the McNeil Center, among others, has written a number of articles on this work, and also has co-edited HOSLAC, is that? HOSLAC, which stands for the History of Science in Latin America and the Caribbean. He's currently working on a new history of American exploration, which is the topic of his paper today. After Cameron, we'll hear from Diego Pirillo, who is professor of Italian studies at the University of California at Berkeley, where he is also affiliated with the history department. His work explores how mobility, displacement, and colonialism shaped the intellectual and cultural history of early modern Italy, Europe, and the Atlantic world. His publications include The Refugee Diplomat, Venice, England, and the Reformation, which came out in 2018, and was also awarded the 2019 MLA Aldo and Jean Scaglione Prize for Italian Studies, and more recently, the Atlantic Republic of Letters, Knowledge, and Colonialism in the Age of Franklin. Again, a very pertinent topic, which is forthcoming in 2026. This book, studying the transatlantic circulation of books and information in the long 18th century, examines how early American scholars envisioned and coordinated the colonial project. And last, but of course not at all least, is Laura Clerx, who is a PhD candidate at Boston College. She brings a background in research and postgrad work in biology to her doctoral studies in history, and is currently completing a dissertation entitled Nature's Properties, Science and Commerce in Early America from 1780 to 1850. She remains grateful to have received support for this research from here, the APS, and I should say Diego, too, was a fellow here at the APS. As well as the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And she recently began serving as Senior Editorial Assistant for the Journal of the Early Republic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cameron to get us started.
Good? All right, thank you all very much for this very spirited conference. So the paper I'm giving today on African exploration is part of this broader book-length project that I'm doing that I'm calling Knowledge is Survival, a new history of American exploration. And the idea of it's really to turn our assumptions about the practitioners and goals of exploration on their head, right? Like we have this vision in our minds that explorers are these white guys building empires. This is not untrue, but my book's trying to tell the other half of this story about the indigenous black and white folks who start exploring to survive the world that colonialism creates. So in this project, covering more and more time, it sort of goes back to the mythical oral history past, really gets going around 1200 and goes into the late 1800s. And so the piece I'm talking about today is coming from what I expect to be the next to last chapter on the Revolutionary era and the early Republic. And in today's talk, I argue that during the age of revolutions, both black and white Americans sent explorers to Africa to save their respective communities from each other. That for African Americans, this is rather obvious, right? That white folks oppressed them all the time, including northern free blacks, and they were really seeking a path to greater freedom, greater safety in Africa. Well, at the same time, these are individuals who really were starting to conceive of this sort of broader African diasporic community of enslaved people throughout the Americas, but also indigenous Africans. And they really saw these expeditions as part of this broader effort of uplifting and really saving all of these peoples. But these enslaved and also free African American would-be explorers really lacked resources. They lacked political clout. So they found themselves relying on powerful white Britons and Americans to undertake their projects. And in doing so, they really found themselves having to negotiate with white people who had very different priorities and whose own priorities get entered into the equation. So for these white folks who end up often sponsoring black exploration, they're really concerned about their destruction at the hands of black people. That white Americans really encourage blacks to explore Africa because they hoped that the observations and the reports coming out of Africa would encourage African American immigration to Africa, and thus, in their minds, save white America from these dreaded perils of slave uprisings and race war. And it's really worth mentioning just how intense a fear this was among white Americans around the age of evolution. As Thomas Jefferson put it, he was sure that unless we got rid of black people and sent them somewhere else, it would end up in a race war that would, quote, end with the extermination of one race or the other. So this paper then really suggests that these expeditions to Africa were integral to, but at the same time kind of challenged longstanding interpretations of exploration during the Age of Revolution. So that exploration in this era was not just a tool of white empire builders like Captain Cook, Lewis and Clark, these people who you've heard a lot about, but it also enabled people who really feared for their own liberty and for their lives to pursue knowledge that they hoped would save them from domination and destruction. So in the Age of Revolutions, which I'm putting around 1760 to 1820, which is a pretty standard definition, both enslaved and free black folks in America really seek greater freedom by discovering routes to Africa. And throughout, for enslaved people, you see a lot of this in the runaway ads, one of our main sources for the travels of fugitives. And a lot of these point to the, at least in the minds of the white people who wrote these ads, the intent of enslaved people to find paths back to Africa. As one ad from Georgia in 1775 puts it, that 4 people fled in a stolen canoe and headed out into the ocean with the plan of, quote, look for their own country. At the same time, and what I'll be focusing on mostly in today's paper, is how free African Americans in the North were also pondering expeditions and undertaking them to Africa. And although they were not enslaved, these are people who faced a relentless assault on their liberty and often the threat of violent re-enslavement at the hands of slave catchers. And a lot of this movement sort of congeals around these voluntary associations that start to form in northern cities in the aftermath of independence. And the first group to really push this agenda is Newport's Free African Union Society, which in 1787 hatches this plan to, quote, send a number of men from among ourselves to Africa to obtain information, acquire lands, and report back home on what they find. And if their observations are favorable and the reports are good, to immigrate en masse to West Africa. Their plan also encompassed a vision of saving Africans, that they wanted to Christianize African heathens in their mind. There was a very sort of uplift aspect of this in their minds and really save Africans from what they saw as the destruction of the slave trade. And these free black men and women in the North were particularly interested in Sierra Leone, which has recently been founded as this sort of experimental colony for freed people by the British government, but one that they really knew very little about, aside from the fact that it existed. Not surprisingly, this group in Newport really lacked resources, though it couldn't really fund this expedition themselves. So they started looking to white allies, including the Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who is this Newport minister who for a while now had been envisioning a plan of training formerly enslaved missionaries, sending them to West Africa. And he ends up becoming a big booster for this movement in Newport, that he goes on these fundraising campaigns and such, and very much encourages the Newport group to, quote, search that country for a place where a settlement may be made, because in his mind it could, quote, draw off the blacks and save America from a great calamity. This plan, though, it sort of loses traction until 1794, when another voluntary association in the northern states, out of Providence's African Society, took action. As the secretary of that group, James Mackenzie, put it in a letter to the Newport group, the plan was, quote, to inform ourselves of what we would wish to know by sending a man of our own complexion to Sierra Leone. And the man who ended up going was James Mackenzie himself. So his reports from this expedition are lost, but what we can gather from the fragments left is that he was very interested in not only analyzing the kind of possibilities for agriculture and relations with local people, but also the sort of judicial system and how much it would actually protect the freedoms, their sort of natural rights that they expected. And through the negotiations with the British governor, Zachary Macaulay, they were able to sort of get Macaulay to kind of hedge his bets. And he says, all right, I will welcome 12 immigrant families to Sierra Leone from Providence, but they need to get a letter of recommendation from Samuel Hopkins to come. Because as he wrote in his letter to Hopkins, quote, he feared that the poison of the age of reason may have pervaded even this class of men. And this is a quote I've thought about very differently in light of Michael's paper from yesterday, that this Providence group that might actually, in the mind of Macaulay at least, been very much one of these kind of radical intellectual communities that conservatives like Macaulay were very much afraid of. So I'm eager to work that into this paper. For reasons that aren't clear, but probably very much reflect Macaulay's concerns, Hopkins refuses to write these letters of recommendation, and this vision stalls again. The main guy who would pick this back up over a decade later was Captain Paul Cuffey, who is a Black and Wampanoag Quaker. He was a ship owner and a mariner based out of Westport, Massachusetts. And in 1809, he started pondering this, what he called a voyage to Sierra Leone, in order to inspect the situation of the country, a very exploratory goal. And again, in this sort of diasporic community sense, that, as he put it, as I am of the African race, I feel myself interested for them. So from 1811 to 1812, he undertakes this reconnaissance voyage. We'll sort of skip over the details to this. There was a lot of enthusiasm from the British and initially from the federal government for this, but it really stalls out in the midst of the War of 1812 with this embargo between British and American trade, and there's a refusal to allow him to undertake this project on the part of Congress. But Cuffey is really able to keep this project alive, because at the same time he's circulating reports to the British and the federal government, he's sending this whole other set of oral and published reports directly targeted toward the African American communities. And he's really taking a lot of effort to disperse information that he gathers in Sierra Leone to drum up support for immigration. And it sort of works that after the War of 1812, Cuffey's able to lead a group of 38 free migrants to Sierra Leone, but it's not really as many as he would hoped, and the venture really bankrupts him. So that by the time he gets back to America, he feels this, urgent need to sort of build up alliances. And the way he chooses to do this is by really playing to the fears of white colonizationists, people who wanted to send off black folks to Africa so they wouldn't be here. As he puts it in his message to one of the sort of leading white colonizationists at the time, that if they were to help support this venture, it would, quote, prevent all insurrection and bloodshed that these guys were terrified of, at the same time saving whites from, quote, swift destruction. And early colonizationists really glommed onto this, and they pumped Cuffey for information, everything about Sierra Leone and West Africa, because he was truly the sort of American expert on this topic at the time. And they were asking about all the things he discovered and encouraging him to go exploring again to find a suitable site. Cuffey's really sick and basically dying at this time, but he does really steer the ACS, the American Colonization Society, towards Sherbro Island, which is just south of Sierra Leone. And he's really sort of pushing this as the ideal site for a colony. So this infamous American Colonization Society, which is founded just a few months after Cuffey's return, really becomes the driving force behind exploring and colonizing West Africa by the late 1810s. And while they did pay lip service to the idea that this venture would, save African Americans, it would save Africans, it was really a project driven by saving white Americans from black Americans. As one of the founders, Robert Harper, put it, he said, "The danger of cherishing in our bosom a distinct nation which can never be incorporated with us need not be pointed out." Still, the ACS really, the leaders really recognized that exploration was an important first step in all of this. Not only would it provide, the sort of exact information that they needed about where to go, who to meet with, who to treat with, but they had this very sort of sanguine idea that if they came back with quote, facts, that this would overcome the distrust in the minds of African Americans towards colonization as this white-led enterprise. And the African American community sort of broadly very much turned against this plan when it became under the aegis of these sort of white slave owners who ran the ACS. Oh, did I not get there? Oh, sorry. So one of the Society's first official actions then was to send the Reverend Samuel J. Mills and Ebenezer Burgess to, quote, explore part of the coast of West Africa for the purpose of ascertaining the best situation for colonizing the free people of color. So Mills and Burgess went in 1818 and came back with these very glowing reports, right, about how fertile it was, how much the indigenous people really wanted them to come, how healthy it was until Mills died. And the ACS, though, is really eager to publish good news. So they, and they're glossing on this report that they published in their annual report, talking about how the report, quote, must have satisfied every impartial mind, saying that this is the thing to do. But the ACS really faced a credibility problem. The African Americans, as I mentioned, were deeply critical of colonization as a white-led enterprise, and they didn't trust the society, they didn't trust its agents' reports. So in a very odd irony, the ACS came to believe it depended on black explorers to advance its goal of saving white America from black people. As one ACS founder put it, however distrustful of the whites, black Americans will confide in the reports made to them by people of their own color and class. And as you all know, the history of science is chock full of examples of white people discrediting black people's observations and knowledge, and this is an interesting case in which the shoe is very much on the other foot. So the ACS really began actively recruiting, quote, individuals among them worthy of trust and confidence to explore the country and present its importance to their brethren in such a manner as must command their fullest confidence. Although, as I said, most African Americans were deeply skeptical of the ACS and its goals, Some people did jump on this offer. For instance, there were 19 men in Philadelphia who sent a group letter to, quote, offer their services to go to the coast of Africa on wages for a year and return if they choose and bring back the report to America. And the ACS's really star explorer was a minister from Maryland, Daniel Coker, who was among the first colonists to go to Sherbro in 1820. And he had this deal with Maryland's branch of the ACS to send back reports and open letters that they would publish in their reports. And in his earliest journals and reports, Coker really praised Sherbro. He's like, this place is where you can come for freedom. We are uplifting Africans. We are ending the slave trade. Come over and join us. And he really leaned on his, his authority as an on-site explorer to validate his, very optimistic assessments. As he put it, none but those who come and see can judge. 3 months later, a third of all these colonists are dead. And by 1821, Croker's journals had really changed in tone to a record of, quote, sickness, death, and disappointment. And the ACS started kind of quietly filing these away in archives instead of publishing them in the fear that their own star explorers' reports had really backfired on their expectations. Ultimately, because of the sort of mass of bad reports coming out of Sierra Leone, mostly about death from malaria, Black explorers' reports really did little to attract new migrants to Sherbro, which in 1821 would become the colony of Liberia. But this colony would never have taken root if both Black and white Americans during the Age of Revolution had not believed that exploration and colonization could save their respective people. And I think it's really interesting that this tradition of salvatory exploration really persists in Liberia, that after achieving its own independence in 1847, Americo-Liberians like James Sims and Benjamin Anderson start going on these explorations into the African interior on behalf of the Liberian government, both to save their own fledgling republic, and also because they had this ongoing goal of ending the slave trade, uplifting heathen Africans in their minds. So all of which is to say is that for Liberians and Americans alike, safety and salvation very much continue to remain just beyond the horizon, something to explore and discover over there. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, thank you to the organizers. This is such a wonderful conference. I'm so glad to be here. I'm learning so much. I was a fellow of the APS in 2022, and I'm so glad to have the chance to be back and to share some of the work that I did actually when I was a fellow here. So my paper focuses on two early American collectors and antiquarians. The Swiss scholar Pierre-Eugène du Cimetière and the early American scholar Benjamin Smith Barton, who was professor of Materia Medica at the University of Pennsylvania. They were both members of the APS. Du Cimetière, briefly, he was the curator of the museum for a few years between 1776 and 1781, while Barton was more influential. He served not only as curator, but also as vice president of the APS. The paper I'm presenting today is based on the last chapter of my book, entitled The Atlantic Republic of Letters, Knowledge and Colonialism in the Age of Franklin, which is forthcoming with Penn. So I would like to give you a very brief overview of the larger project so I can situate these two case studies. But before I start, I just want to alert the audience that the events I trace in this paper and in my book are very violent and disturbing, and that there are long-term consequences that still haunt us today. Okay, so I'd like to start from a very famous painting, Samuel Jennings' Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences, commissioned by the Library Company of Philadelphia and completed in 1792. Liberty in the guise of a pale-skinned blonde woman garbed in white, is seated in a neoclassical temple. She's surrounded by various emblems of the arts and sciences. At her feet, there is a broken chain. Across from Liberty, there is a group of black figures, 2 men, a woman, and a child, who bow and stretch out their hands in an attitude of supplication. Behind them, the temple opens onto a landscape scene where a larger group of black figures sits, stands, and dances around a liberty pole. Traditionally, the painting has been considered an expression of the progressive politics associated with Quaker abolitionism, and especially with the Library Company. More recent scholarship, however, has challenged this interpretation, calling the attention to the Library Company's ties to the slave trade, to the painting's references to the revolution in Haiti, which had just begun at the time, or to the racialized construction of liberty, arguing that what the painting reveals is in fact the racial politics inherent in Anglo-American abolitionism. I'm interested today in one single detail, specifically in the depiction of books, and especially in the book that Liberty is holding, which is the catalog of the Library Company. This is significant also because a new library catalog had just appeared in 1789. It was a very ambitious catalog inspired to the Encyclopédie by Diderot and D'Alembert. But instead of reading the painting as a simple celebration of books, as a vehicle for abolitionism and liberation, I see it as a statement about the close connection between knowledge and colonialism, which is the subject of my book. So I study the relationship between books and conquest and argue that in early America, the life of the mind was inseparable from colonial violence. In 18th century North America, when European rule was anything but firm and stable, early American scholars helped to imagine and put into practice the colonial project. Although they publicly fashioned themselves as cosmopolitan and impartial scholars, they worked in tandem with political and religious powers and tailored their ideas to the needs of their patrons. The cultural institutions they created were far from ivory towers. Libraries, such as the Library Company, function as both repositories of knowledge and colonial outposts. Book collecting was hardly a disinterested pastime. Through the ideas they circulated and through their material form, European books served as the embodiment of colonial authority. They were not only scholarly tools to be read and annotated, but also markers of status, and were consciously used as such in the processes of elite formation and consolidation. Not only were books, libraries, and cultural institutions founded by the wealth created by the slave trade, but I argued the very taxonomies and classification systems that Euro-American scholars devised directly shaped the colonial enterprise. Various disciplines and intellectual practices, such as botany, lexicography, historiography, antiquarianism, and so on, served as the instruments of European order, facilitating the classification and subjugation of North America's nature and peoples. So while my book builds on the work of scholars who have studied the Republic of Letters in early America, such as Caroline Winter, Mark Peterson, Anthony Grafton, my book is not concerned exclusively with intellectual history. Rather, it focuses on the relationship between books, intellectuals, and colonial governmentality, and explores the way in which knowledge circulated and shaped conquest. Precisely because they lack the power to dictate terms to indigenous peoples, colonists invested in cultural capital to supplement their precarious authority and navigate the volatile political landscape they faced. Scientific knowledge served to imagine a colonial mastery that in the 18th century continued to be a far-fetched ambition rather than a realistic and achievable goal. Scholars could easily implement taxonomies and classification systems over book, artifacts, and natural specimens, but had little power over the infinity of indigenous peoples that inhabited the continent. Ordering knowledge in libraries, museums, archives allowed them to keep imperial ambitions alive and to elude an unstable balance of power that was rarely in favor of European colonists. While indigenous peoples understood settler colonialism all too well and thwarted its plans through diplomatic and military efforts, I also suggest that they began to lose ground, at least in Northeast North America, at the end of the 18th century. So if initially the Republic of Letters developed within a middle ground that forced both parties to adapt and accommodate, colonial intellectuals eventually contributed to break down the accommodation system. Although this was a long and winding process, I consider the 1779 Sullivan expedition against the Iroquois as a decisive turning point. The Sullivan expedition, which indigenous activists and scholars now refer to as a genocide, forever changed the Iroquois' relationship with the American government. And as I show in the paper that I'm presenting today, it was precisely at that moment that the first anthropology museums were established in America, collecting spoils of war and transforming them into display objects. Early American scholars relegated indigenous peoples to a distant past that would inevitably be overcome by Euro-American civilization. So my first case study, I'll now briefly touch upon the two case studies that I've examined in my paper. So my first case study concentrates on the Swiss scholar Pierre-Eugène du Cimetière. He moved to America in 1763 and worked for various government projects as archivist, curator, and painter. In June 1782, beset by financial difficulties, du Cimetière decided to turn his personal cabinet of curiosities into a public museum. And in presenting his museum in 1782, he divided his collection into two broad and we could say generic categories, naturalia and artificialia, two categories that have long been used by early modern collectors. Among the naturalia, du Cimetière included all sorts of natural specimens, while most of the artificialia in the museum consisted of indigenous artifacts. So the du Cimetière museum was substantial, but it was dispersed. We still have du Cimetière's archive manuscripts, but not the objects in his museum. But nonetheless, his letters and papers contain abundant evidence on the provenance of the indigenous artifacts in his museum. And this is just one example. So dozens of items in du Cimetière's museum came from the plunder of General Sullivan's campaign against the Iroquois. Du Cimetière placed close attention to the campaign, collecting all the material he could find. Among his papers are not only copies of Sullivan's journals and letters, but also a rich body of notes on the itinerary of the expedition, as well as the military strategy employed by the American army. His interest lay not only in military affairs, but also in the geography and ethnography of Iroquois. His notes include illustrations of various artifacts, places, and peoples encountered by Sullivan. So as du Cimetière correspondence reveals, in the late 18th century America, the collecting of indigenous artifacts developed as a result of the growing anti-Indian violence of the revolutionary years. Along with objects, warfare also gave American collectors a chance to add indigenous bodies in the form of scalps and other human remains desecrated and removed from burial sites to their museums. And that was also at least du Cimetière tried to do that for his collection. While they bring to light the provenance of the indigenous collections, du Cimetière's papers also indicate to what end the items were gathered and put on display. So during the Revolutionary War, du Cimetière's museum, and that's my thesis, served as a giant repository of information on Native Americans, a repository that celebrated US military victories and at the same time facilitated the ongoing dispossession of indigenous peoples. Sullivan and other army officers did not simply donate artifacts, but they also visited the museum to deepen their knowledge of the Six Nations. In February 1781, for example, Sullivan borrowed several maps, including one of the Indian country and another one of his march. The Cimetière museums also had hundreds of books and gave visitors access to a wide range of written sources of Native American cultures and languages. Among those who borrowed books from the Cimetière were Anthony Benezet, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Rush, and many others. So I move now to my second case study, the cabinet of the APS, where du Cimetière worked as curator from 1776 to 1781. So in 1799, the Transactions of the APS announced the creation of a committee devoted to the study, I quote, of the antiquity, changes, and present state of America, requesting members and correspondents to send their contribution regarding the customs, the customs, manners, languages, and characters of the Indian nations, ancient and modern, and their migration. In order to carry out such a project, the Society proposed to systematically gather Indian artifacts from burial sites in North America and investigate the content and structure of Native American tumuli. In February 1796, a number of Indian antiquities was presented to the Society by Colonel Winthrop Sargent, Secretary of the Ohio Company of Virginia, a group of Revolutionary War veterans and speculators seeking to develop land north of the Ohio River. The Society entrusted Benjamin Smith Barton, who was curator of the museum and also professor of materia medica at the University of Pennsylvania, to prepare a drawing and a description of the Indian antiquities presented by Sargent. Following the methods of 18th century French antiquarians, Barton published drawings of each object, drawings that appeared in the transactions that you can see here on this slide. So he published drawings of each object and recorded the object's shape, color, and size, as well as the material and techniques used in their manufacture. Examining the three objects made of copper, Barton pondered over the technique used to produce them and suggested that the art of hardening copper had been developed, in his words, by a people more ancient than the Incas. In his view, this suggested that the artifacts and the tumuli in which they had been found had not been built by Native Americans, but rather by an ancient civilization, which he defined as a race of people who had made much greater advances in the arts than the present races of Indians. End of the quotation. Barton remained vague on the identity of this ancient civilization, speculating that it might coincide with the pre-Columbian Toltec civilization and highlighting their cultural affinities with the Aztecs, which he considered a people much more polished than any of our present Indian tribes. And so to conclude, for Barton, indigenous artifacts and tumuli proved that North America had once been inhabited by a highly sophisticated culture of mound builders whose glorious past augured a successful future for the new American Republic. Like Du Cimetière's museum, the collecting of Indian antiquities at the APS was weaponized to serve the colonial agenda, positing the existence of an ancient American civilization and arguing that this was responsible for the artifacts found in the Ohio Valley. Barton denied Native Americans the status of original inhabitants, framing them as invaders who had sacked the mound builders' kingdom as the so-called barbarians had done, causing the fall of the Roman Empire. By occupying and selling indigenous lands, Euro-American colonists could thus claim that they had not displaced a native population, but rather restored the ancient American grandeur. And I'm going to stop here, but let me just acknowledge that the historical events that I traced have significant long-term consequences that are still, and we are still confronting these consequences today as the current controversies over restitution and repatriation suggest. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, so thank you everyone for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here and be a part of the panel. Thank you to the conference organizers. I'm going to present today on a small piece. Let's see, this is the, okay. A small piece of my larger dissertation project, which is entitled Nature's Properties, Science and Commerce in Early America. And it explores how the members of early American scientific societies were deeply invested in the creation of a national economy and how their engagement in both the practice and theory of political economy actually shaped the understanding that they had and that they codified of the natural world. If you've looked at my larger paper, which I kind of hope you haven't, there's like 2 parts, but for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the first piece of the paper, and it advances kind of one argument, which has to do with the way that mid-19th century codified published science has this historical dimension and is based out of the experiences of people working to kind of create a viable colonial political economy during this age of revolutions. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Nope. There we go. Okay. So it was not until the 1830s that the salt-bearing rock of the Ohio Valley became the object of geological study in anything like the modern sense. In 1833, the Ohio physician Samuel Prescott Hildreth published in Benjamin Silliman's American Journal of Science and the Arts an article entitled Observations on the Saliferous, or Salty, Rock Formation in the Valley of the Ohio. And so at this point, Silliman's journal has become kind of like the de facto publication of the Connecticut Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as soliciting contributions from others. Hildreth's father had been a shareholder in the Ohio Company, a late 18th century land company formed for the purposes of settling New Englanders in the Ohio Valley region. Although his father never relocated from the family's home in Massachusetts, Hildreth the son migrated to Marietta, the company's first settlement town, in 1806. Some 27 years later, he presented readers with his descriptive geology of the Ohio Valley. He described the region as sitting atop a formation of saliferous rock, extending more than 100 miles in breadth and several hundred in length along the Allegheny Mountain Range. He speculated that this saltwater-containing rock was present in regions where sandstone predominated, reasoning that the 2 rock formations were known to accompany each other. But he cautioned that hypotheses like this one needed to be confirmed, as rock strata often varied in thickness and position depending on particular and local circumstances, such as the presence or absence of a river. How had Hildreth come to this knowledge of Ohio geology in 1833? The first Ohio State Geological Survey, to which he would be assigned as an assistant, was not authorized by the legislature until 4 years later in 1837. The first official report published by this survey repeated much of the information contained in Hildreth's 1833 article in Silliman's journal. But by this time, readers were given images, detailed vertical cross-sections of the rocks that lay beneath the surface of the state. The first page of the report shows a vertical series of shaded rock strata, proceeding up from the bottom layer, which was called the Great Limestone Deposit, to the upper coal series. In 2 places in the image, one to the left of the bolded text denoting the Scioto River, and the other to the right of the bolded town of Jackson, Ohio, are small italicized notes denoting the location of salt wells that had been previously dug into the rock strata. The wells, small and insignificant as they appear in the report's cross-section, bear testament to the ways in which the Ohio Valley's geology came to be known to science. Salt, indispensable in the preservation of food and the care of livestock, was a vital commodity in early America. In the 18th and 19th centuries, many people living along the eastern coast of North America obtained salt made by evaporating seawater. The presence of this necessary component of daily life became a selling point for those who might settle beyond the easy reach of the eastern shoreline. And projectors of migration and settlement schemes seldom neglected to name salt among the mineral resources that might be found in abundance in the territories that they advertised. The Ohio Company was no different. The 1780s trans-Allegheny world was one of competitive geopolitics centered around control of land, resources, and trade. In a 1788 pamphlet designed to encourage subscription to the Ohio Company venture, company director Manasseh Cutler explained the value of the new territory with reference to its place in a regional economic geography. The situation of the Ohio lands alone, he said, quite apart from their natural fertility, close quote, would offer the Ohio merchants an advantage. Before the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825, New Orleans seemed the most promising trading outlet for goods from the Ohio Valley. Merchants who settled in the Ohio country could, Cutler predicted, pay farmers higher rates for the flour, wheat, and hemp grown in upstate New York because it would cost them less to transport these commodities down the Mississippi River to East and West Florida and the West Indies. Likewise, the Ohio merchant could outcompete the Philadelphia merchant in carrying goods to the markets of Spanish-controlled New Orleans and West Florida. Cutler's vision for the region's economy extended beyond the British Empire's colonial focus on trade and foodstuffs to embrace the manufacturing capacity and the potential for a regional economy. The availability of raw materials and the ease of their transportation, he wrote, meant that there is no place more suitable from its situations and productions for the establishment of manufactures than this. Salt springs and coal mines in particular abounded in the new territory. Despite Cutler's glowing insistence on the presence of mineral resources, access to salt proved difficult for early settlers in the Ohio River Valley. In the 3 decades after the Revolution, they still imported nearly all of their salt from East Coast cities. From the period of the Ohio Company's active settlement in 1788 until Ohio's incorporation as a state in 1803, a bushel of salt cost from $4 to $8, which is well above the 30 cents that Ohio citizens would be paying by 1848. On the settlers' part, this was not for lack of trying to take advantage of the salt springs in and around the Ohio Company's property. In 1789, company surveyor James Backus noted in his field book a rock formation from which some kind of salt exudes. A few years later, in the midst of war between the United States and the Northwest Confederacy of Native Peoples who lived in the territory now claimed by the United States, settlers learned from war captives of nearby springs where their native captors boiled salt. The mere suggestion that salt rock might really be present in the company's purchased lands stimulated the directors to take action. The following year, 1790, when the company revised its method of distributing shares in land, they stipulated that all salt springs would be reserved as the property of the company rather than individuals. Salt, one of the few commodities that could be exchanged for cash on the money-scarce frontier, was considered of such value to the settlement that they invited individuals to lease lands from the company and receive loans in exchange for erecting salt works. The Ohio Company's attempt to control production at the salt springs was short-lived. In 1796, Congress passed further territorial legislation stipulating that the right to control and lease minerals in the Northwest Territories belonged to the federal government, and this lasted until Ohio's incorporation as a state in 1803, at least on paper. In reality, after the Treaty of Greenville in 1795 resulted in land cessions from the Wyandot, Lenape, Shawnees, and other peoples comprising the Northwest Confederacy, settlers from Kentucky quickly crossed the Ohio River and began to work the salines along the Scioto River illegally. They worked the salines seasonally, much as the natives had done. They came mainly in the summer months to make cash, and the methods they used were likewise similar to indigenous people who obtained the salt by digging into the soft sandstone until the brine puddled up, removing it and boiling the brine in kettles. When Ohio became a state in 1803, it too regulated, it too regulated all known salt springs as public property and leased them to those who would produce salt. The stated goal of the legislators was to prevent any one individual from gaining a monopoly over salt production in the state. Like the Ohio Company and the territorial government, the legislature was perhaps motivated partly by the prospect of lease revenue and partly by the ability to exercise control over supply and pricing. In 1803, an agent was time okay. Okay. In 1803, an agent was appointed to administer leases and to see that no one person monopolized the work. From 1806 to 1810, encouragement from the Ohio State Legislature in the form of subsidies led to the intensification of operations at a site known as the Scioto Saline. The digging of deeper wells, drilling or boring of rock to greater depths, the erecting of furnaces, and the use of coal as a burning fuel instead of wood. These initial encouragements were successful, and the price of a bushel of salt decreased to $2.50. When the salt water in the shallow wells began to slow, the 1815 Ohio legislature offered a $750 subsidy to salt workers who would bore the rock to a depth of 350 feet and create deeper wells. These deeper wells yielded stronger salt water, but not enough to compete with salines in other parts of the state or nearby states. By 1826, settlers in Kentucky and West Virginia were working even stronger salines, and the legislature realized it would be unable to compete profitably. Turning its interest toward coal and petroleum, the state relinquished its ownership and sold the salt works. Okay, so again, how does all of this answer the question of how Hildreth came by his geological knowledge of Ohio in 1833? In 1799, a settler named George Crookham traveled from western Pennsylvania to southeastern Ohio to work as a salt boiler at the furnaces which had been constructed along the Scioto Salines in Jackson. While engaged in digging salt wells and ditches for the wooden piping that carried brine to the furnaces, Crookham became fascinated by the fossils in each layer of dirt he removed. 30 years later, when Hildreth and others began to work on Ohio's first geological survey, it was George Crookham who told him about Ohio's rocks. After Hildreth's reports were published, Crookham even sometimes corrected his reasoning about cause and effects, reminding him that it was his experience of the material properties of Ohio's rocks upon which Hildreth relied for evidence. So, for example, in 1838, after his report is published, he writes to Hildreth, "In your report of last year, where you speak of the Great Salt Well at Jackson, I see an inaccuracy in the words, probably from a deficiency in carbonated hydrogen gas. The gas was by no means deficient, it rose in great volume through the water." So he's correcting his experience of the natural world. And it was not only Crookham who served as a source of information. The reports of miners and salt boilers fill the pages of Hildreth's scientific work. It's not difficult to see how a salt boiler's knowledge might assist in understanding the locations of vertical strata and the underground layout of a given area. In his 1833 article in Silliman's Journal, for example, Hildreth drew directly on the records of he called workmen, pulling from notes kept by a salt boiler named L.G. Barker, who had listed the qualities and appearances of the rock at successive depths during the digging of his well. Hildreth created a table of the rock types at given depths on the Muskingum River region of Ohio. Of the 1,001 feet of rock covered in the table, 820 feet had first been described by Barker as he drilled his well. Describing the relative positions of rock strata in different parts of the state, Hildreth did not shy away from remarking that his findings were, quote, confirmed by facts connected with the boring of salt wells. In other instances, too, he made explicit his reliance on evidence collected by salt workers. That the salt-bearing rocks were usually white porous sand rock, but could sometimes also be reddish, he knew from watching or hearing about the sediment that the workmen pulled up in their tube pumps. He knew that salt-bearing rock was not overly hard or dense from the fact that it was, quote, easily pierced by the drill of the well borer, and this was a great contrast from the quartz strata that overlay it, which was by contrast so very dense and hard that it occupies from 3 to 4 weeks of constant labor, night and day, to drill through 9 feet of rock. Early American geology was shaped by the imperatives of colonial political economy in the Ohio Valley. Scientists like Hildreth and other geologists on the state survey came to understand the properties of saltwater-bearing rock in terms of the labor required to obtain salt. Indeed, they considered this kind of hands-on engagement with the material world to be precisely the sort of activity that garnered evidence and facts appropriate to scientific analysis. But note, however, that this is not the same thing as saying that they considered the workmen who are collecting the evidence to have scientific authority in and of themselves. Many opportunities for early American science, I'm contending, would not have been possible had they not followed on the heels of large-scale economic experiment. As the salt boiler George Crookham found, boring wells for salt production provided the opportunity to compare fossils found in each layer of rock. Comparison of fossils and rock strata became a necessary component of rock identification in 19th century geology. Indeed, Hildreth referred to himself as the assistant geologist and paleontologist on the state survey. Further, the particular nature of salt worker reports, particular and local nature, that their wells hit brine, for example, at 250 feet along the upper Kanawha River, and that it took drilling to deeper depths as one descended the river, lent Hildreth and other surveyors the many points of evidence that they needed to collate in order to depict the vertical cross-sections of the underground in different parts of the state. Drilling at these depths would not have been possible without the state subsidies and encouragement that the Ohio legislature provided throughout the first 2 decades of the 19th century. The more intensive economic engagement that followed upon the state's political incorporation provided opportunities for the elaboration of geological science on a more intensive scale than had been possible when the Ohio Company was first formed. All right. Do I have time? Okay. I am, of course, I'm just going to kind of wrap it up here, but I am, of course, not the first to point to the fact that state power facilitated scientific knowing throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. But what I'd like to call more particular attention to today is the way that early American science operated within the context of attempts to work out a viable political economy. By doing so, I think we can see more clearly how the intensification of science in 19th century America was made possible by increasingly intensive economic engagement with the natural world, beginning in the late 18th century and increasing through the 19th. Another way of saying this is that we can view 18th century science in many cases as subservient to the science of colonial political economy. And when we do, I think a couple of things fall into focus. I think the sort of bizarre and eclectic to modernize nature of a lot of these publications and the transactions of scientific societies make more sense. And also the sort of social role of these men who are often the great majority of them are officials or elected to state legislatures, are also primarily engaged in business and commercial enterprises. I think a lot of that falls into focus. Recent work in the history of European science in this period has shown the development of natural and physical sciences to have been deeply embedded in the socioeconomic context of the early modern state. This work has focused especially on the cameralist states of Central Europe. The United States, too, participated in a similar, though not specifically cameralist, plan of natural resource development in their quest to generate useful knowledge. Members of early American scientific societies participated in a transatlantic Enlightenment impulse to organize the early modern state. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for what became American science. And I'll just add one more thing, which is that American participation in this search for useful knowledge was sort of self-conscious in its imitation of enterprises across the Atlantic. So when Hildreth compiles his geological table of the Muskingum River region for Silliman's journal in 1833, the editor, Silliman, right, the Yale chemist and geologist, adds an editor note explaining why his colleague labeled the rock strata according to, quote, the local terms of the country rather than their geological names. The practice, Silliman assured his readers, accords with the general practice in Europe where local matters of fact relating to mining operations are frequently stated in the language of workmen, for the miners and borers for saltwater and coal are rarely familiar with the terms of geological science. Okay, and to conclude, by the time of Hildreth's work on the Ohio Geological Survey in the 1830s, science and the rhetoric of statesmen and scientists themselves came to be seen as a necessary precursor to economic development. In his advocacy of a state geological survey in 1836, for example, the governor of Indiana opined that, for want of the proper test of science, the extent and value of the coal seams in this state are unknown. But as we have seen, the science to which this rhetoric referred would not have been possible without prior economic investment by state and corporate ventures like the Ohio Company. The more intensive economic engagement that followed upon the state's political incorporation provided opportunities for the elaboration of natural science on a more intensive scale in the early 19th century. The knowledge that appears to undergird political and economic development in the mid-19th century was collected out of the on-the-ground experience of those who labored to build the colonial economic infrastructure of the Age of Revolutions. Thank you.
Yes, good. Okay, there we go. Thanks so much to all of the panelists for these really rich papers. I have a lot of thoughts about a lot of things. I'll try to keep them brief, and then we'll open it up to conversation. So as perhaps is unsurprising for a session about exploration and collecting, colonization sits at the core of all three papers. Yet each of them presents justifications and motivations driving the push for settlement in different ways. So Cameron Strang got us started by demonstrating how African explorations of the African coast and the eventual creation and settlement of Liberia were motivated by concerns over safety articulated by both blacks and whites alike. For blacks, it was a desire to establish their own sense of economic security and individual betterment, free from the reliance on white Britons and Americans. And then for white Americans, the colonization of Africa offered an opportunity to avoid what seemed to be an inevitable violent race war between the two groups. And as Cameron shows, these layered motivations aided the establishment of the African Colonization Society in 1816 to support the relocation of blacks to Africa. So I love in this paper how you talk about the different ways that people are employing this rhetoric of safety and security. But when I always think of safety, I also think about risk. So my question to you is, does the conversation or does the analysis that you're employing in kind of thinking about this larger problematization of exploration and kind of troubling that category, does that look different when you think about it through factors of risk as opposed to factors of safety? For Diego Pirillo, talks about the early collection of indigenous materials, which in his paper starts with books, but also encompasses artifacts, vocabularies, as well as bodies, as being part of an intellectually generative outcome of conquest and dispossession of indigenous communities as a direct result of military conquests across North America. He also shows how these acts of collecting and categorization played a role in countering European arguments about American degeneracy, using antiquarian arguments that reaffirmed the supposed inferiority of Native Americans as a way to both reassert America's political and scientific potential while also rejecting indigenous sovereignty. So in other words, there's an argument being made here about the actual practicality of colonization as a mode of evidence building to essentially further justify future colonization. So I, as a historian of anthropology, I was obviously very interested in this paper and would love you to talk more. You didn't talk about it in the presentation today, but there's a part in there where you talk about Barton's work of sketching, of creating drawings of artifacts as a way to further his antiquarian arguments. Would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that and also what is lost in that process of kind of flattening material forms to you know, images themselves. And then also would love to hear you kind of problematize some of the categories that you present in the paper. So you talk with Dusamitier, you talk about his use of naturalia versus artificialia, with Barton, the ornamental and the superstitious, and then of course these larger claims about antiquarianism versus historicism in kind of situating indigenous peoples within different temporal modes. So would love to hear you think a little bit more about how those categories inform one another and the places where they kind of fall apart, and then what that means for sort of longer term legacies of collecting practices and the continued inclusion of indigenous materials in museums of natural history. I think that that has been a point of tension within anthropology for a long time, and would like to hear you, since you did at the end kind of mention this question of restitution and repatriation, think about how these kind of longer legacies come into play. And then finally, Laura Clerx illustrated how early settlement of the Ohio Valley was directly linked to a desire for easy access to salt found in saliferous rock, which as she explained, was a vital commodity both for the culinary tastes and preservation needs of early Americans. And she shows that these imperatives of 18th century colonial political economy supported the pursuit and dissemination of geological knowledge of the region well into the 19th century, imperatives which in turn mobilized geological expertise that was attained by amateur geologists expertise that was then taken on by miners who themselves were also incorporating indigenous knowledges. So you see, sort of this layer, no pun intended, of knowledge kind of driving the conversation. So I'd love to have you think a little bit more about scale in this presentation and how this argument you're making about the directionality between political economy and science in this period maybe looks different depending on the kind of size of the project at stake. So if you've got multiple laborers involved versus, sort of an individual naturalist going out and collecting things, does that argument look different? And then conversely, what does that mean when you think about citizen science as a project where you're thinking more about developing knowledge economies versus financial ones? So I'll leave it there. And then for everyone, I wanted to ask you to kind of think about a question that started to come up yesterday about the relationship between individuals and institutions. And I think each of you has different institutions at play in your papers. Cameron, you've got the ACS, the APS obviously is one driving this, and Laura, you also talk about the Academy of Arts and Sciences. So thinking about the span of time that each of you presents from going from the revolutionary era into the first decades of the 19th century, how does the role or the relationship between institutions and individuals shift in this period? And what does that mean for the different ways that justifications for colonization are getting employed? So I'll stop there because I know that's a lot and let you take whichever parts of that you'd like to respond to.
Thank you very much. Those are great questions. And this issue of risk I find really interesting. And for those of you who read the longer paper, there's a quote in there about, not remembering it exactly, but how when they're trying to organize one of these Northern Voluntary Associations trying to organize this expedition to Africa, they talk about how all these young men in this group claimed their willingness to sort of risk their lives and go out in search of this new homeland for their people, right? And for me, risk really matters in the sense that it makes heroes. And this is a really interesting part of exploration, I think, that not only in the sort of European tradition of exploration are guys like Columbus and Lewis and Clark very much seen as heroes. And this goes back in Europe to Alexander the Great and guys like this. And for me, one of the really interesting parts of this project is that I've rooted all of these expeditions and explorers for the last 800 years or so in an older kind of mythical tradition or oral history tradition. Maybe not older, maybe one that develops amid colonization and exploring, right? But and in these older histories of exploration, indigenous ones, West African ones, European ones alike, there is this sort of shared understanding that when things are bad, when our people are in danger of getting destroyed or my family's in danger of getting destroyed, a solution is to go somewhere else and look for something. And this could be powerful objects, this could be new homelands, this could be new sort of esoteric knowledge, but this is a sort of recognized solution. And it's these people who risk these ventures that, discover these things, sort of go down in legend as heroes. And it's the persistence of this tradition, I think, is something that's really interesting and part of the ongoing motivation for people to do this, that it's like, not only do I get to save my people, I get to become a hero. And so in that sense, I'm very much interested in tracing this kind of intellectual history of resistance, right? And there's obviously a ton written on indigenous resistance, African American resistance, et cetera. But very little of this is sort of grounded in intellectual traditions, much less traditions that we tend to think of as part of the realm of the history of science. And so this is something I'm really interested in unpacking. And hopefully I'll get to your question on individuals and institutions, but let's pass it on. So.
Thank you. These are all great questions. I'll try to answer 3 points that you raised very, very briefly. So, do cimetières and its categories. First of all, the cemetery is mentioned now and then, but I think is very much a forgotten figure in the intellectual history of Red America. He was, for example, appointed historiographer to the Congress, but he never received his stipend. He died in poverty. Most of his writings are in manuscript form. So, so the categories, so naturalia and artificialia, these are very broad, generic categories. He was aware that other scholars in early America, in New England, for example, were collecting indigenous artifacts, but the museum that he created was, to some extent, unprecedented in early America. And so he was really very much looking at models in Europe and in Britain, for example. So we know that in his library, he has the catalog of Hans Sloane Museum, or the catalog of the Royal Society Museum, and so he was really working with these models in his mind. For Barton, so I didn't have time to say that, but Barton was very much, in my view at least, was really trying to put into practice Jefferson's ideas. So Jefferson responded to this influential French Jesuit Lafitau, who published a very influential work comparing the languages, especially of Native Americans, to the languages of ancient Romans and Greeks. Jefferson rejected this theory and said that these were just speculations, and in order to study Native Americans, it was necessary to collect objects and describe them very accurately before forming theories. And so that's why I think Barton was trying really careful and also in a very controversial and speculative way to draw and describe objects. So he was putting into practice Jefferson's ideas and also employing some very, so the best theories that he could find in the books by French antiquarians. There was one, Caylus, that was very important for him that he also cited. And then the long-term consequences, very, very briefly, of course, I think Du Cimetière and also other museums in that area, this is the very beginning of salvage ethnography, which we trace back normally to Boas or also to passages in Lévi-Strauss. But this is all the controversies today around repatriation and restitution, I think, make very clear that these long-term consequences are still with us. I just want to say that this is not a story unique only to America. No, so the British Empire did that all over its colonies, from India to West Africa. So there are very many similar examples that we can find. And so just one is the looting of the Benin bronzes in Nigeria in the 1890s. And different institutions responded in a different way. And so I just want to say that the British Museum has decided not to give back the bronzes yet. And so the controversy is very much open.
Thank you. So I think, okay, you asked me about scale and directionality and whether looking at things at different scales changes okay. So I guess I would say, first, yes, there's definitely a way in which the sort of scale of economic operation is going to make the science that comes out of it appear, or it's going to change the sort of ability for laborers and workers to contribute to science, right? So if the state's not subsidizing the digging of wells to like 350 feet into the ground, you're not going to have the geological survey, right, that is able to depict those cross sections because the funding, I mean, there's no like separate funding structure for science other than maybe like the premiums that the scientific societies are giving out, right? And I think the 1780s and 90s are littered with sort of desperate people trying to get money from the government to fund their inventions and their scientific ideas, right? So there's one sense in which I definitely see this kind of like economic scale, sort of large scale operations making possible the sort of maybe more intense sciences, we might say, like these sort of geological sciences that depend on large scale operations. But so then you might say, okay, but like collecting or botany, right? Like, are those things really, is it the same situation? And I guess what I would say is, obviously there's a variety of what's happening, right? So some people like Manasseh Cutler, who's the director of the Ohio Company, are also, I think Ellen talked about him yesterday as well, using the sort of just local surroundings, neighbors walking around in their environment to collect and collate information and publish it. But I'll also say, when I think about scale, I think about like what's making possible most of the science that's being published in the late 18th century. And there's something really interesting that happens. So sometimes it's commercial projects, sometimes it's military projects, where if you look at so I have a chapter in my dissertation that looks at some of the first publications that come out in the memoirs of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in the late 1780s. And there's a paper there by General Benjamin Lincoln, who was Washington's adjutant general, who received the Sword of Surrender from Cornwallis at Yorktown. And he has a paper in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in the late 80s, early 90s, which is about like the rise of the water level and the rocks on different sides of the York River, Jamestown, of the James River, right? And when you read it, it seems purely theoretical, and you're kind of like, oh, well, that's interesting that he's interested in this. And then you look at the date that he sends the letter, and it's during the campaign, right? And so I think about like what mobilizes people and what makes possible these observations. Because I think one of the other things that I'm trying to sort of say about early American science is that the kind of category between experience and experiment is still fluid in this period, right? So like I think when we look at it more in terms of like experience of the natural world is a valid way to collect facts that are going to kind of be contributing to science, it sort of broadens the playing field. I don't know.
All right, so I enjoyed all three of these papers tremendously. And I have a question that I'm going to apply to all three because it appears in different aspects. It occurred to me when I went back and looked at the conference description that we were looking at science and society in the age of revolutions for the Atlantic world. And we've had some Atlantic papers, more England, North America exchanges. Cameron, you bucked that trend, and so did Guinea grass yesterday. But all three of you have Caribbean connections. So for you, Cameron, at the same time that folks are exploring African colonization, there are efforts in Haiti and, of course, in the British West Indies post-emancipation. And I'm pretty sure you're going to say that's another part of your book. But I wanted to go ahead and put that out there. De Cimetière, I did notice in his description for his American Museum that his artificial collections were both West Indian and Indian. And for salt, one of the primary ways of getting salt, there were domestic sources, was importing it from the West Indies, from the Turks and Caicos, or from the Dutch ABC Islands. And I didn't know if there was any conversation about, I study coffee. In the early 19th century, there's a big language about trying to find a domestic source of coffee so that we can buy local as opposed to importing. I didn't know if that was part of Ohio's strategy. So I guess my overall question, because I do need to ask one, is what happens to your papers when you broaden the lens from North America to include the Caribbean?
That's not going to be part of my book. I got a lot going on already. But I will say that, I have a lot of notes, like all these things to read about Haiti, right, in the early 1820s in particular, because at this moment when colonization in the United States gets kind of co-opted by these white guys at the ACS, a lot of these black voluntary associations start redirecting their attention to Haiti. And that's really all I know about it at this point. I don't know to the extent that they actually launched expeditions to go. I suspect that they did. The Haiti angle is something I'm considering adding maybe as a paragraph to the section, right? The British West Indies, that's getting a little too far afield. I'll just say I don't know, and it sounds awesome. But.
I have only one chapter dealing only in part with the Caribbean, and so with regard to the painting that I used at the beginning, so some scholars mentioned that the revolution in Haiti just began, and so that painting, Liberty, might be also a reaction, a Philadelphia reaction to the events in Haiti. But I didn't really go in that direction in my book, what I studied and what I found in Du Cimitier's paper is the fact that he, before he moved to Philadelphia, he lived in Jamaica, and so he spent years traveling in the Caribbean and taking extensive notes on natural history. So he mostly followed Buffon rather than Linnaeus. But what I found very interesting is that he was in Jamaica during Taki's revolt. So he personally witnessed Taki's revolt. He gathered material. I think from what I can say, he was not on the side of the rebels. He supported the point of view of the government. And so also he, along with his museum, I think he had a very interesting archive, which is still at the Library Company today. And interestingly, so this archive was supposed to trace the history of the colonies up to the revolution, but there is almost no reference to slavery in North America in this archive. And so I was really interested by this silence.
Yeah, to speak to your question about importing salt and whether that's comparable to coffee or other commodities, I think what I've seen so far is the descriptions of salt in the Ohio River Valley in my research have come through more as sort of advertisements for settlement, right? This is something that's attractive, but there is a sort of patriotic component where they're talking about the promotion of domestic manufacturers. I have not seen them single out the West Indies specifically, which is interesting because there are other instances where they're sending publications to the scientific societies about maple sugar trees, right? So the presence of substitute sources of sugar there, but I'll have to look further. That's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a really excellent panel. I always think about linguistic knowledge. This is my comment and question are going to be about linguistic expertise. I always think about linguistic knowledge as sort of a precondition to any kind of field science or exploration or collecting venture. And it was woven in really interesting ways through all of your papers. I guess the question first came to mind, Cameron, when you were speaking about these kinds of ethnological interactions or expeditions, I guess. And so I just, I always wonder about it, it's sort of, yeah, like I say, a precondition to anything we might want to say anthropologically or geologically or, in terms of, the naturalia that are collected. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, because it's something that we don't often see in the historiography of science, and I always wonder why. Diego, your response to Adrianna's question suggested that maybe linguistic knowledge and expertise are being effaced or erased at the source, in a way. You see this almost as though there's this claim to reject any kind of linguistic knowledge in favor of the material characteristics as a way of saying, oh, this is scientific, right? It's not humanistic in some sense. But then, I think sometimes the way that we write histories tends to perform this erasure. So that's a general question about, linguistic expertise, how it's figuring into your projects, and if you see it there at the source or in your own accounts. Thanks.
Sure. So, this is a great question, and this is a very, very important point. So, I only have, I didn't really have time to say that, but Du Cimitière especially had a very, very pronounced interest in linguistics, philology, and in the study of indigenous languages. And that was, I find that remarkable compared to other early American scholars. For example, James Logan in Philadelphia, he dealt with indigenous peoples constantly, in diplomatic councils, in treaties, and so on. He had no interest in indigenous languages. We can see at this library, no interest in indigenous languages. He was a skilled linguist, learned Arabic, Hebrew, and so on, no interest in indigenous languages. That was not true for Du Cimitière, and I think so Du Cimitière collected dictionaries, of several indigenous languages, I think because he understood the relationship between linguistics, philology, and colonialism. And so he understood that by studying languages, one could learn that culture and dominate that culture.
Yeah, I'll give a very short response. That the extent to which they didn't seem to care is kind of remarkable. Like the guys who went to Sherbro had the advantage of Sierra Leone being right there, and they had interpreters like John Kizzle sort of readily at hand. But you don't see anything in the kind of preparation of like, oh, we better like study the language. With the exception of this guy, William Thornton, who I'll try not to go on a side, but he was his parents were plantation owners in the Caribbean, and he, before sort of planning his venture leading this sort of exploratory venture into Africa and colonization, he's like, I'm going to go to my parents' plantation and like start studying languages. But that's the only example I can really think of people preparing in advance to do this. And it's kind of interesting that everyone else involved is like, this guy's a crack. Like, we don't really care what he thinks.
Yeah, excellent panel. Diego, I have a question for you. In the drawing that Barton, of the indigenous artifacts that Barton sent over, I noticed it was addressed to Joseph Priestley, who is most famous as a chemist and not as an archaeologist. Did you see any reply by Priestley to that inquiry, since it was addressed to Priestley himself?
It's a great question. No, I haven't seen any reply. I'm not aware of any reply. The only thing I can say is that Barton published this was an article that he published in the Transactions, but before becoming an article, the article was a letter addressed to Priestley, and that was very common. Articles were written in a letter form and then published in scientific journals, but I'm not aware of any reply.
Great. Well, I think that this session has given us a lot of food for thought, but I think it's now also time for lunch. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panelists again.